Welcome to a new deep dive from Green Dolphin Science.
Great to be here.
Today we're zeroing in on something incredibly common, salt.
Right. Table salt.
But we're not just thinking about, how it tastes. We're plunging into a really interesting study from Helion. It looked at microplastic pollution throughout the entire process, the whole journey of making the food-grade salt we use.
Yeah, specifically through solar evaporation. And the study focused on sites in Spain.
So for this deep dive, our mission is really to unpack this research.
Exactly. We want to understand where these tiny, tiny plastic fibers are coming from during salt production.
And how the process itself affects how many are there, right?
Right. And ultimately, what it all means for the salt you sprinkle on your dinner.
Okay, so let's get into it. The researchers, they looked at brine and salt samples from 6 different production sites in Spain. Salinas, they call them.
Salinas. And what's really useful is the variety they covered.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, some were coastal, using seawater. Others were inland, using brine springs. And they looked at big industrial operations, but also smaller artisanal ones.
And even an abandoned one.
Yes, exactly. One that wasn't even active anymore. That variety gives us a much, much broader picture. Not just one specific type of production.
Right. It helps compare things, see if the location or the method makes a difference.
Precisely. It's key for understanding the different potential sources and pathways for these microplastics.
So the big question first, are microplastics actually in our salt? I mean, according to this study.
Well, the study confirms what many suspect. Yes, they are present. They found them in the environment around these sites.
In the water and the air.
Both. In the seawater, obviously, but also just in the air. And what's really fascinating is that the study points to atmospheric fallout, basically, stuff settling out of the air as a primary way these pollutants get into the salt production process.
Wow, okay, so it's literally raining plastic fibers, potentially.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
Think about fibers from clothes, textiles breaking down, they get airborne, and then they just settle everywhere, including in these open salt pans.
All right, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Tracking them through the process, they measured concentrations, right?
They did, and the numbers are quite something. In the initial water, the seawater or brine coming into the Salinas, the concentrations varied a lot.
How much?
Anywhere from about 256 items per liter up to 1,500.
1,500 per liter, that's quite a range.
It is. But
Yeah.
then look at the final product, the packaged salt, the stuff you'd buy.
Yeah.
The estimated concentration there was quite a bit lower, between 79 and 193 microplastics per kilogram this time.
Per kilo. Okay, so much lower than in the initial water, concentration-wise.
Exactly. Which suggests that maybe the process itself isn't adding huge amounts more, and perhaps some are even removed or just don't end up concentrated in the final salt crystals.
That's interesting. And you mentioned one site, an artisanal inland one, Salina F. It had the highest initial microplastic content.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a surprise. You might think, oh, the big industrial sites.
Right, more activity, maybe more contamination.
But no, Salina F had the highest initial load. It really highlights that it's not just about scale, the specific environment, how exposed it is to that atmospheric fallout we mentioned.
Yeah.
That seems crucial.
Okay, so let's walk through the production stages. They took liquid samples at different points.
That's right. 4 main points for the liquids. First, where the water enters the whole system, the seawater or the spring water.
Stage 1.
Then, where it enters the evaporator or concentrator ponds, stage 2.
Got it.
Stage 3, the inlet to the crystallizer ponds, where the salt actually starts forming. And finally, stage 4, the outflow from those crystallizers, the leftover brine or mother liquor.
Right, the really salty stuff left behind. And comparing those first 3 stages showed different patterns.
It did, yeah, especially between coastal and inland sites. The active coastal Salinas, they actually showed a decrease in microplastics as the water moved through stages 1, 2, and 3.
A decrease. Why would that be?
Well, the thinking is that the seawater they start with is already pretty contaminated, maybe higher than the inland brine.
Oh, okay.
So perhaps some of those initial microplastics are just settling out in those earlier, larger ponds before they even get to the crystallizers.
Makes sense. What about the inland ones?
They showed a different pattern. An increase from stage 1 to stage 2 entering the evaporators.
An increase. Why?
The study suggests this could be ongoing airborne pollution landing directly into those open evaporator ponds. More surface area, more time exposed.
Okay, so air pollution adding to it.
Potentially, yes. But then they saw a decrease again by stage 3, entering the crystallizers. So maybe settling happens there too, just a bit later in the process for inland sites.
It's complex. And that abandoned site E, that was different again.
Completely different. It had the highest concentration right at stage 1 in this exposed lagoon area.
Just sitting there collecting dust and microplastics.
Essentially, yes. It's a stark example of how significant that atmospheric deposition can be over time, especially in an undisturbed, exposed water body.
Okay, let's shift from the liquids to the solids, the salt itself.
Right. Stage 5 onwards, they looked at the crystallized salt as it formed, then washed salt, if the site did washing at stage 6. Stage 7 was stacked salt, basically salt piled up and stored for at least 6 months.
Okay, sitting in a pile.
Then salt packaged right after harvest, stage 8, and salt that had been packaged for over 6 months, stage 9. So really covering the post-crystallization journey.
And what did they find comparing, say, industrial versus artisanal sites at this point in the final salt?
Interestingly, the amount of microplastics in the packaged salt was pretty similar between the two types.
Really? So the scale of production didn't make a huge difference in the final count?
Apparently not, based on these findings.
Yeah.
Which is quite intriguing.
And what about the packaging? Did putting it in bags or containers add more plastic? That seems like an obvious potential source.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the study found that packaging itself didn't seem to add significant amounts. When they compared the stacked unpackaged salt stage 7 with the packaged salt stages 8 and 9, the levels were often quite similar.
Huh. That's actually kind of reassuring, I guess.
It is, in a way. It suggests the main contamination isn't necessarily coming from the final plastic bag or cardboard box, at least not in large amounts.
But they did notice something about black fibers increasing later on.
Yes. A slight increase in black fibers in the final stages at some sites.
Any ideas why?
The researchers pointed towards vehicle tires and conveyor belts, the machinery used during harvest and transport. Wear and tear could release those black rubber or plastic particles.
Makes sense. Rubber dust, bits of belts.
Okay.
Let's talk size and color of these things. They focused on fibers.
Yes, primarily fiber-like microplastics, like tiny threads.
And what about size?
They found that the larger size ranges were dominant, mostly things between 200 and 630 micrometers, and even bigger ones up to 5 millimeters or 5,000 micrometers.
Larger ones. Why is that significant?
Well, it ties back to the atmospheric fallout idea. Larger, less dense fibers are perhaps more likely to be carried by wind and then settle out compared to very tiny fragments.
I see. So the size profile supports the falling from the sky theory.
It seems to, yes.
Yeah.
And color-wise.
Transparent was the most common currently, followed by blue, red, and then those black ones we mentioned.
Any theories on the blue?
Yeah, the researchers had a thought maybe from the clothing worn by the salt workers, like workwear shedding fibers.
Another potential source right there in the process. It shows how easily this stuff gets around.
Definitely. And remember the abandoned site, E, it had a different color pattern.
Right. Predominantly black microplastics there, unlike the others where transparent or blue lead.
So again, the specific site conditions seem to matter a lot for the type of microplastic, not just the amount.
Exactly. Different local sources, different accumulation patterns.
So if we pull back and compare inland versus coastal, the big difference seems to be the starting point, right?
It looks that way.
Yeah.
Air pollution seems like a really significant contributor for those inland Salinas. They aren't starting with contaminated seawater like the coastal ones are.
Yeah, they're getting brine from underground. So any plastics in those early ponds are more likely to have arrived via the air.
That's the strong suggestion from the data, yes. Yeah. That increase they saw from stage 1 to 2 at inland sites points that way.
Whereas coastal sites start with polluted seawater.
Correct. But the fascinating part, as we touched on, is that despite these different starting points and initial trends,
they end up with similar levels in the final packaged salt.
Pretty much, yeah. The final concentrations per kilo were in a similar range for both coastal and inland sites.
Why do you think that is? How do they converge?
That's a great question. It could be that the settling processes in the ponds, the crystallization itself, maybe those physical processes have a sort of leveling effect regardless of the initial load or source.
Possible.
Or perhaps other factors they didn't measure, like subtle differences in managing the ponds or local weather, play a role in reaching that similar final level. It's not fully clear from this study alone.
Okay, and lastly, how do these numbers stack up against other research? Did they compare their findings?
They did. They found their range that 79 to 193 items per kilo in the packaged salt is generally consistent with previous studies on Spanish salts.
Which found what kind of range?
Those previous Spanish studies reported roughly 50 to 380 items per kilo. So a current study falls well within that.
Okay. And globally?
Compared to some global reviews of sea salts, the concentrations found here are generally lower than the average reported elsewhere.
So, while finding plastic is obviously not ideal, the levels in these Spanish salts aren't necessarily off the charts compared to global findings.
That seems to be the case, yes. Present, but not exceptionally high relative to other studies.
So let's try and wrap this up. What does this all boil down to for you and me?
Well, this deep dive really drives home that microplastics are getting into the salt production process right from the start.
And the air seems to be a major pathway, not just polluted water sources.
Exactly. Atmospheric fallout is key. But what's also striking is that the production process itself, while maybe adding some contamination like those black fibers,
Doesn't seem to be the main driver of the final concentration. And packaging isn't adding huge amounts either.
that's what this study suggests, yes. The levels in the final salt, while concerning because they exist at all, are fairly consistent with other regions, sometimes even lower. And they don't seem to skyrocket during production or packaging.
And that consistency between coastal and inland sources in the final product, despite different starting points, is really thought-provoking.
It really is. It underlines just how pervasive these tiny pollutants are in the wider environment, finding their way into seemingly pure products like salt through various routes.
It definitely makes you think. If salt produced like this contains microplastics, likely from the air, what other everyday things are we maybe not thinking about?
That's the crucial takeaway question for you, the listener. What else might be subject to this kind of unseen contamination from the environment around us? This study is a really valuable piece of the puzzle in understanding where microplastics come from in our food supply.
Absolutely. Some real food for thought there.